Okay. So welcome everybody to the October, just the last day of October edition of the International Centre for Translational Digital Health Seminar Series. As everybody knows, we're alternating seminars hosted by the different hubs. And this time it's the Remote Monitoring and Virtual Care Hub's turn. So my name is Sabine Venderveer. I'm the Manchester lead for the hub, and Professor Alex Casson, who's my colleague here at the University of Manchester, kindly agreed to deliver a talk for the seminar series today. Alex works in the Faculty for Science and Engineering. I'll leave it to him to do a detailed introduction of his background. But Alex does a lot of work on wearables and using those wearables to collect data directly from people and patients to learn more about their health and condition. And this time, Alex, I think you're going to talk about long COVID and wearables.
Yeah.
All right. So shall I hand over to you? There's any housekeeping? So I think, Alex, do you want people to put questions in the chat? Or are you happy to be interrupted?
I'll probably power through if that's okay. So you
Okay.
put chat or hand up later.
All right, let's do that. So you can either keep your questions and ask them at the end, or use the chat, and then we'll ask you to open your mic at the end of Alex's talk. All right, Alex, over to you then.
Right. Okay. So firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to present today, and to those of you, if there are any from Melbourne, for getting up so early in the morning to come. So in this presentation, I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of an introduction. I've got a few slides kind of overviewing the work that we're doing in my lab here at the University of Manchester. And then I've picked out kind of two case studies, as it were, to go into a bit more detail on, both reflecting some kind of recent papers. One about personal light sensing, and one about long COVID. Before we get into the first part, looking at the background and the introduction and whatnot, I just want to kind of put the acknowledgements up. I always like to put these at the start of the presentation to really highlight that, this is a team effort. There are lots of people who have worked on different aspects of the work, which I'm going to be presenting today. Lots of different funders as well. Thank you to them. So, as Sabine said, I'm based in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at the University of Manchester. So I'm an electronic engineer by background. I would always describe myself as an engineer rather than anything else. But I think, as we all probably know, particularly on the more translational side, we really have to work cross disciplines. I would be a strong believer in team science, in kind of having a team working on the different aspects that we need. And that's reflected in some of the kind of cross affiliations or kind of honorary visiting positions that I have, really trying to build in cross-disciplinarity, not just kind of talk about it, as it were. So I'm actually sitting at the moment in what's called the Henry Royce Institute. And it's a little bit complicated, but it's reasonably accurate to say this isn't part of the University of Manchester. This is a UK National Research Institute focused on materials, and we'll see a few examples of that later. I've just reached the end of my term, but I had a similar position in what's called the Turing Institute, and that's the UK National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. We won't see so much of that in this talk, but obviously wearables collect a huge amount of data, and machine learning and real-time machine learning is an important part of those sort of systems. One might question why my medical school affiliation is in Leeds rather than in Manchester. but I have an affiliation over in Leeds there. And in the UK, our hospitals have what are called clinical engineering departments. So they're responsible for doing the engineering aspects, making bespoke devices, kind of maintaining medical devices and whatnot. And so I have an honorary position in our Northern Care Alliance clinical engineering department. So we're trying to kind of build in that sort of aspects. In terms of my lab, I based a lot of my thinking on this diagram, which is one I made it's probably about 14 years ago now. And really, our work focuses on how we go kind of from you, a person, up to the cloud, right? And if we're doing that with a small portable sensor that you put on these days, we would call that a wearable. And there's lots of electronics in the electronics world between you and the cloud, and that's what we're interested in making. Importantly, of course, we're interested in going back the other way, and there's an offset where my pen's not drawing, where I'm putting it down. It's an interesting one. But not just getting data, but doing stuff with the data. Sometimes we talk about getting actionable insights from data. Often it's about behavior change. You know, if you think about current wearables, it might be about motivating people to do exercise more. But that feedback route is an important part of the overall system. And so I started off, when I did my PhD, very much in the low power electronics that goes into these sort of systems. You know, we didn't have the sort of wearables that we have available today back then. If we fast forward to now, my lab has got activity across the complete spectrum of all of the different system blocks that go into making such a system. So in terms of some of the more materials research, we've done lots of stuff around flexible electronics. And so really this is for going into kind of next generation wearables, ones which can kind of flex around the body rather than being rigid electronics that sit on top. Very much actively trying to get involved in sustainable electronics. And that's kind of less focused on some of the translation piece. It'd be more kind of behind the scenes, but an important aspect in terms of next generation electronic engineering. And the NHS already has kind of net zero and similar targets that suppliers need to be aiming to hit in order to be supplying into the care system in the UK. In terms of machine learning, if people want a big data lab, someone who's going to do just kind of data mining and that sort of stuff, generally speaking, that's not what my lab would do. And there are probably better labs out there for doing that. What we would tend to focus on would be constrained machine learning. So usually it's power constrained because it's got to operate in a mobile phone or on the wearable device, but also time constrained. For some of our closed loop systems, we don't have time to send data from you to the cloud and get it back again. If we want very, very responsive systems, we maybe have 20 milliseconds or so. And so all of that kind of edge machine learning, we've got activity around that. And of course, edge is important for things like privacy and so on. And we've got a number of different projects around closing the loop. Generally speaking, we're doing that kind of electronically. So with things like electrical stimulation or auditory stimulation based upon when we detect that an event has occurred. Now, within that all of that spectrum, I think undoubtedly my lab is best known for our work around non-invasive brain interfacing. We've got a couple of example papers on the screen there. And we've still got a number of activities kind of ongoing here. But deliberately, that's not what I'm going to speak to you about today. I'm going to go slightly broader in my portfolio. Also, I'd say what we've received a lot of funding for in recent years is for doing flexible electronics to go into kind of next generation wearables. And again, I've got a couple of slides of this. I'm not going to go into too much depth because we're not quite at the translation stage here yet. We're still, and the focus of the centre is around translation. So this is still at the kind of fundamentally making them work kind of level. It is very difficult in a picture like this because I need the whole slide for it. But to show that this is a flexible device, it's transparent on a yellow background. And an important part of our work is really looking at scale-up compatibility. So here you can see some of the flexibility. And what I would tend to say is that around the world, you'll find quite a few labs working on stretchable, flexible electronics. There's relatively few who have 100 meters sitting on their shelf behind you. This is the carpet in my office here, if I was to angle the camera down. And I say building on that, looking at adding in things like sweat sensing, the sort of kind of wet biomarker type analyses which aren't available in current wearable devices, and bringing in some of the sustainable electronic angles and whatnot. But again, I thought I would deliberately not speak about that. I'd focus more on some of our more translational pieces, kind of up at this end, if you allow for the offset, and it's meant to be slightly further right, aspects of my research portfolio. So I picked out two examples. Firstly, on light sensing, and really in some ways these are running through some of our recent papers. So one of these papers is still at the preprint stage. We've got the revisions due, as I think they were due yesterday, but I got an extension. Just some minor changes still to do to that. And then one of these papers was published in PNAS about a month or so ago now. But we were interested in light sensing because light sensing has a massive impact on your health. Right? And we'll see some examples of that in a minute. It's the sort of thing which isn't available in most off-the-shelf wearable devices. There are one or two you can get with some caveats. And equally, what we'll see, we're interested in a very particular kind of light sensing, not just any kind of sort of thing. Because in terms of the drivers from a kind of a healthcare point of view, it's probably fairly obvious to say that our light exposure today is very different to what it was historically. If you go back hundreds, thousands, whatever, however many years, what our bodies were kind of used to. So that applies in the daytime, and I'm under some artificial lights here with a wonderful grey sky outside. It's the same at night, which historically would have been very dark, whereas now all manner of artificial lights potentially up close to you just before you go to sleep. And and that just mapping out those light patterns, how they're different today compared to how they may have been historically. And light impacts lots and lots of different aspects of health and well-being. So we have a circadian rhythm, and that is modulated by our light exposure. So there's an example on the slide here. Staying on the brighter side of hospital, reduced pain medication use. Right. Higher daytime illuminance in offices leads to higher daytime alertness. Some of these are relatively well known, if that makes sense. They're kind of almost common sense. They're in line with what we're expecting for different settings. But actually, we've not had the ability to measure light exposure and light exposure in a particular way previously. Right? And so we set about with a number of colleagues to make a wearable light sensor. Doing that not in a controlled laboratory setting, but doing that in the wild. And of course, pairing that with measures around alertness and sleep and getting data behind some of the things that we might intuitively expect. So this is the wearable device that we made. I'll go into a little bit of detail on the electronics, but not too much. The important thing to flag on this slide is this CIE standard SO26. And so you may recall that in your eye, it's well-known two types of photoreceptors, right? There's the rods and the cones. And there's also a third type, which was discovered a number of years ago, which don't form an image in your eye. They're non-image forming cells, but they affect your overall perception of the amount of light and similar that is present. Right. And so what CIE standard 026 did, established in 2018, was look at making a standard not for just saying there's 10 lux of light here or however much light, getting a standard that reflects how your eye is responding to light. So we're measuring light in the same way as your eye is, not for image forming purposes, but for circadian rhythm monitoring purposes. And that's what differentiates this work compared to some of the earlier works which may have just had a photodiode, a photoresistor or something which changes with the amount of light, but doesn't do anything kind of more informed than that. So we can see the wearable that we designed here. If we zoom in on it a little bit, we've got a breakdown of the different parts here. We set it up by default to measure once every 30 seconds. We did do experiments kind of with quicker sampling and slower sampling and picked 30 seconds as kind of a reasonable kind of trade-off point. We didn't necessarily know how quickly people would be changing lightscapes. We've got a rechargeable battery in there and a couple of other kind of auxiliary sensors for activity and whatnot. By default, the way you measure light is in a parameter called counts. That is what the fundamental light sensor that's in the middle of our board there is. It outputs something called count. And so what we did was we made an artificial light source inside a dark box, which could go everywhere from kind of 0 lux up to kind of the brightness of the sun. So something like 9 orders of magnitude here, controlling the kind of wavelength that we give out, in order to measure, in this case, the linearity of the sensor that we have going in. We have a little bit of step there. Oh, you now can't see it because I've drawn over it. Of it dropping out at the very low end, but in general we get very good linearity across the complete range. And then there's an associated toolbox which takes counts and maps those to what are called the alpha-opic quantities. So there's a number of different ones of these reflecting how your eye is responding to light. The photo-optic, and then the melanoptic are the key ones that we're going to kind of hear more about. But again, we can see with our kind of our calibrated source, we get a very good dynamic range, a very good linearity. And then taking the set on the bottom here, taking the sensor out into natural environment, so not in the dark box now, and having a big light measurement unit next to it. Again, we get very good correlation between the wearable unit and the non-wearable unit. We did things like thinking about where do we want to put the sensor. The kind of assumption was, in an ideal world, you'd have it as like some contact lens, possibly. You want to measure light as is measuring the eye. That wasn't really realistic to do in terms of the time and budget and whatnot that we had available. Actually, I think it probably would be now if we got a bit more money. I think we do have the technological knowledge now to do a Google smart contact lens type setup. There's a number of things that be made of like pendants that you can wear around the neck. We were quite keen to look at a wristband location to just be like another smartwatch. So not having something to wear in a different location and all of that sort of stuff, something which is where people expect, by and large, wearables to be. And so we also did an experiment looking at, how does the accuracy differ depending on whether you're wearing your wrist this way. So you got the watch this way up, or maybe you've got it the other way up in different environments and so on. And here we've got just an example from one person of the data that's being collected. So we can see the kind of activity to the day, what someone's walking about, temperature, and then the melanoptic EDI measurement. The red line there is just a cosine fit to that, which is a common thing to do in this phase. And then at the bottom, you've got the ratio between the melanoptic and the photo-optic illuminance. And this is really a sign of artificial lighting. We'll see this a few times. So you can see that this ratio goes down into the evening. And that is what we expect when we have less natural light and more artificial light that we're sitting under. In terms of this CIE standard, there are now a few devices that you can get which measure meeting that standard. I don't think there are when we started, but there are now. And there's some different pros and cons for different points. Ours is the only one we know of which is looking at the wrist for classic smartwatch location. What we also did was have that paired with an app. So things for asking questionnaires. So for example, how sleepy are you? Doing some cognitive tasks. So we can look at, say, reaction times and other things while people are out and about during their day. And probably people who are from Manchester will be familiar with the apps team in Research IT. They actually made the app for this particular case. And so we've done 2 studies now with that setup. The second one isn't quite finished yet, but the first one is kind of the larger scale kind of natural light monitoring experiment where we're also giving them kind of behavioral questionnaires and responses to do, and we can look at the associations between actual light exposure and what people are telling us. So we did that for 59 participants over the course of a week each. And I'll just know that 4 people told us that they did some shift work during the course of that week, because of course that affects when we might expect people to be getting up. In terms of this first graph, so this is kind of averaging or plotting in each case the light exposure that we're getting, and by and large, this is telling us what we think we would expect to be seeing. So in panel A there, again, we're seeing that the ratio between melanoptic and photooptic light is decreasing as we move into the evening, and there is more artificial light around there. We're seeing that people, if you look at, say, panel E, that during the daytime, people are spending more time with more light, and there is most people in the sleep period have very little light around them. Again, if we look at the top panel here, we start to look at that light exposure combined with a sleepiness questionnaire that people were asked to do. The top panel is probably telling us what we would expect intuitively, which is that, the longer you've been awake, this is panel C on the top there, the longer you've been awake, the higher the sleepiness score. People tell us people get tired during the day. And then equally, just looking at the absolute time of day, so panel D at the top, people are reporting that they're more sleepy as they get into the evening, or if they're up very early in the morning. Where I think it starts to get very interesting is when we come down to, say, looking at panel F. There we go, nearly. Where, there's some wonderful, kind of straight lines between the sleepiness scores that people are giving us and the melanotic equivalent daytime illuminance that they've been exposed to, right? Essentially, the more light you've been given, the more good light that you've been given, the less sleepy people people are. And then we see that in panel G in terms of people's sleepiness versus how long they've been awake, but here broken down into people who have had a relatively high 250 lux level of light exposure versus people who haven't. And the people who have had a higher level of light exposure nearly at any point while they're awake are reporting lower sleepiness levels. Right. Now, this isn't operator performance, right? This is just self-reported sleepiness. But, the potential follow-ons from this in terms of operator performance, in terms of accuracy and all of that sort of stuff, really starts to become apparent. And that's before we start closing the loop and doing, manipulations of lightscapes in order to kind of optimize effects. There's lots of detailed results on this slide. Let me come back to it in just a minute. This is the non-stats friendly version of the same slide, because what we also found was there's a time effect. So in general, more light is more light is good for you, more kind of natural daylight type light. But it does make a difference on when that occurs. Okay, so we have a transition point coming at about 6 o'clock. So bright morning exposure, decreased morning sleepiness. Evening light exposure, increased sleeping problems. Stable light exposure in the long term, so having a nice consistent pattern, delayed sleep time. Is that how I'm phrasing that? Yeah. Similarly, in terms of just having kind of good light exposure, so detective alertness went up. So that's what people were telling us, and that was reflected in the cognitive task, in the reaction time tasks that people were doing. So working memory efficiency, visual search speed, and all of that sort of stuff. that's kind of what is brought out in some of the linear mixed model stats here, which I won't go to in too much depth. Some of the key findings are that more light exposure above the recommended limit of 10 lux of the melanopic EDI type in 3 hours of sleep, 3 hours before sleep, was associated with an earlier sleep time. People who had more reproducible patterns of light and exposure to more light in something called the M10, so that's the brightest 10 hours of their day, tended to have earlier bedtimes and less daytime sleep. And with both of those, we also see the opposite, right? Which helps give us confidence in the results. If you have a lower IV and higher M10 in this case, you get the kind of opposite results. So that's giving us confidence that what we're measuring is kind of correct, and it's giving us important and useful insights. So in turn, just to wrap up that bit of work, there's lots of potential direct follow-ons from those findings in terms of some of the direct potential health benefits and kind of modulating lightscapes and all of that sort of stuff. Something which is an ongoing interest in my lab is this shift to what I would call circadian medicine or time varying medicine, or we refer to closed loop medicine quite a few times, right? Most people on this call will probably be familiar with personalized medicine and kind of precision medicine. And there's been lots and lots of investments in that. And you don't have to define them like this, but I think it works most cleanly if you think of those from the genetic point of view. So precision medicine would be trying to say that there are subgroups who we can target, and it might be that intervention X works with them and it doesn't work with other people. Personalized medicine would then be focusing on the individual. So I'm one person. What works for me might not work for Sabine, even if we're in the same subgroup. And really what we're building the technology for now is the step beyond that, right? So I'm me, I'm an individual, but my 1-year-old son kept me up half the night. So I'm a completely different person today to who I was yesterday or tomorrow. And actually the best time to intervene, the best time to deliver treatments might well be very different. And so getting some measures of physiology of what's actually happening, of the circadian clock and what's driving it. That's what's driving a lot of the technology developments that we're doing at the moment. Right, so that's all I wanted to say in light sensing, and in the second case study, I was going to talk about some of our work around long COVID. This work is a little bit more early stage. So here we've got the protocol is online, and the results is still at the preprint stage. We've not had the reviews back from that. So do take this as a preprint level of work rather than something that's fully published. I think when I agree to this, I'm always the optimist, and I assume things will go quicker than they do, and this would all be done and dusted, as it were. I would imagine most people are familiar with long COVID. It's essentially the persistence of kind of COVID-related symptoms or fatigue, dizziness, and similar, more than 12 weeks or so after the end of the acute COVID phase. Estimates of that in the UK, there's about 1.4 million people who are affected by this. And so, it's a very substantial disease area which wasn't on the radar 10 years ago, and so obviously a very important and timely thing to investigate. which I think is also fair to say it's quite heterogeneous. It can present quite differently in different people, and understanding some of the mechanisms behind long COVID is an ongoing thing. One of the potential mechanistic routes is what's known as dysautonomia, right? Which is essentially when the autonomic nervous system isn't quite going as it should, right? There's something called sympathetic overdrive and reduced parasympathetic activity, and I won't go into too many details about those. But there are some emerging thinking on what the mechanisms might be. Now, importantly, with regards to things with the autonomic nervous system, is that in some ways it's hard to measure with the sort of wearable devices that we have, right? If you think about your wearable modalities, the classic first thing is activity. The classic second thing is heart rate. And then probably beyond that, you're thinking about measuring sleep, right? And sleep in particular is a useful thing to be measuring in long COVID, but none of those are necessarily getting us directly to information on the autonomic nervous system. What does give us information on the autonomic nervous system is what's called heart rate variability. So on the top here, we've got an ECG waveform. This is an example from one of my PhD students earlier. And your heart, if even you're just sitting here stationary, listening to this talk, it doesn't beat at a constant rate. There's slight variances between the time of when any two peaks occur, and they tend to go in cycles over the course of approximately five minutes or so. And that variability between when does each heartbeat occur reflects our autonomic nervous system activity. And so it gives us the ability to get some non-invasive measurements of that. And of course, importantly, it's being built into smart watches now. Smart watches tend to do it in an optical manner, and they tend to, of course, to do it at the wrist, because that's where the wearable tends to be. There's a slight difference between heart rate variability, which is kind of measured electrically across the chest, and what's called pulse rate variability. So that's because the time it takes to travel along your arm, the pulse wave can be different. It'll be different. I've got my arm up, or I've got it down, or whatnot. But by and large, I would view those terms as interchangeable for the purposes of this. There's lots of debate about that. So it's starting to be available in smartwatches. So we can do things like kind of prolonged monitoring. Helping to get a picture of kind of what's happening and whatnot. I think you do need to be careful with various smartwatches. They might advertise for video heart rate variability, but as you may know, optical measures are very sensitive to movement. There's lots of artifacts that get introduced when you move, and so lots of watches will only do heart rate variability when you're asleep. And indeed, when you're asleep for a certain amount of time, rather than continuous HRV, which would be nice to have. Anyway, so what we set out to do, this is a relatively small study, was we wanted to go beyond just measuring HRV in people with long COVID. There's lots of studies out there which are about getting data from people with long COVID to try and see what's happening, right? And we got a small bit of funding to go beyond that and say, can we not just measure the heart rate variability, but can we modulate it? Right? Can we modulate the autonomic nervous system activity to kind of push it, ideally, in a direction that we would want it to go? And you can do kind of sophisticated things like that. So there's lots of work that people are looking at around vagus nerve stimulation. So trying to electrically stimulate the nervous system to increase the heart rate variability. In general, higher heart rate variability is better for you. But there's also lists out there showing that actually relatively simple guided breathing exercises. So, kind of deep breath out, guiding people through a program of deep breathing modulates the ANS and can take HRV in the direction that we want to go. And so, yeah, really investigating, not just collecting data, but can a biofeedback program based upon HRV have hopefully a useful effect on people with long COVID. So in this study, we actually did kind of HRV twice, as it were. We did real-time guided breathing based upon HRV as measured with an ECG test strap. And then we also gave people a wearable device for a long time before and afterwards, so we could look at a longer-term thing without someone having to wear a chest belt the entire time. This is a small study. It's not controlled. It's open labeled, and there's only 13 people in it. There were 15 with two dropouts. So as I say, this is not the definitive study on this thing, but letting us answer a few questions on are consumer grade monitors appropriate for doing this? Do we get any indication of having an effect? So there's a wide number of different measures that we did both at baseline and during. So as I said, we only did ECG for like kind of 10 minutes per session while actually doing breathing exercises. But people had then Fitbits before and afterwards. And we also did a number of questionnaires, including one you may not have heard of called C19 YRS. And this is a COVID-specific questionnaire aiming to kind of pick up, a long COVID-specific questionnaire. Things like HUDAS are widely used across different conditions. Right. So if we look at the questionnaire results, on the C19 YRS, on the symptom severity, the top one, a lower score is better. And across our population, we saw a decrease in the score. In contrast, if you look at the C19 YRS global health score, a higher number is better. And that's what we see. It's not a huge change necessarily. It does up by one point. But what we see here is consistency across all of these different measures. So if we look at the EQ 5D, again, a higher number is better, and we see it go up. And so all of these different measures are going in the directions we would expect them to go in if this was having an effect. We've got much more kind of breakdown of some of the Fitbit results. I think one of the key challenges of the Fitbit analysis was you get so much data that knowing how to summarize it and kind of compact it down is a real challenge. We didn't find a lot of significant changes here. The only one, and only just about, is on the HRV measure. So RMS SD is one metric by which HRV is measured. There's a number of different metrics, and in general, higher HRV is better. And we see a higher HRV in the post-intervention period compared to the pre-period. If we look at the kind of qualitative feedback, we got, a wide number of, kind of very positive comments coming back from this. Some of these relating very much to the use of the technology, saying, it was user friendly. We did have a number of issues around reactions to the strap, which surprised us a little bit. We had to put in a number of adverse event forms with just people having a bit of skin reddening. And I think with hindsight, having more straps to let people pick and switch between the kind of vinyl type ones or fabric type ones would have been very beneficial. But from a qualitative point of view, kind of very, very positive. So I say we saw extremely good compliance. So people were doing breathing exercises over a 4-week period. And across all of those, it sums to something like 720, I think, different trials, different sessions, and there was a 92% compliance rate over that, which is I think extremely good. We've got some weight to add that dysautonomia plays a role, and that more interventions that target this kind of might be beneficial. But we do all of that, as I say, noting some of the limitations that we have around size and control and that sort of stuff. But I wanted to include that because that's very much the sort of, in terms of the suites of work that we saw earlier, that's up at the right hand side of kind of people wanting to measure things that they're not able to do at the moment, even though they could fundamentally get stuff, and us coming in to provide engineering support and help to find some interesting things, I hope. So that's all I wanted to go over in this presentation. Kind of thank you all very, very much for coming, and I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe stop sharing your slides. Maybe people want you to go back to some. So feel free to sort of raise your hand or stick a question in the chat if you have one. So maybe, Alex, one of the things that I wondered about, especially with the light sensing part of your presentation, I guess the key for successful translation is to, when you get to the end of the translational pipeline, that you have something that people really need. So it aligns with whatever is missing for a particular disease or for some other kind of need. So how do you keep an eye on that need? Because you clearly start from a need that people want to measure something for a particular purpose, but then you dive into the engineering part where there's lots of graphs and lots of numbers and lots of choices that you need to make. So how do you make sure you keep your eye on what you need at the end of that pipeline?
So I think that's a great question, and I think the answer not tied to light sensing is one about kind of team science and kind of working with people who are doing that as if we're doing the engineering day to day, working with people who are doing the clinical or whatever day to day, making sure that there's frequent interactions and so on. I think in terms of this particular graph, I didn't go into this particular light sensing device. In some ways, it is more of a health and wellness type thing than a medical clinical type thing. And I didn't go over the kind of team in its entirety. So there were kind of essentially 3 parts to the team. So there's kind of my engineering part. There was then the circadian rhythms team, and Mantis is very strong for its biological timings group. But then we also had what's called the Thomas Aston Institute, which is an institute that we have in Manchester. And essentially it's it's a collaboration between researchers at the university and the health and safety executive. So they are responsible for kind of health and safety at work and in other other settings. And so giving a kind of a regulatory angle to it. And I'm not sure I can necessarily go into too many details at this point, but essentially, having published this work now, there's 2 follow-on discussions going on around, well, what does then the regulatory piece or the next generation PPE piece look at, given that we can get measures that we didn't have previously.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, so it sounds great if you have those 3 teams with different types of expertise working on the same thing, but probably poses some challenges, at least different, terminology, different ways of working, different ideas of what output or deliverable looks like. So any key challenges or maybe tips on how to overcome them that spring to mind?
Well, overcoming them is hard to bet. I mean, the key challenge is the first challenge is always funding, right? Because it just gets expensive quickly to have that number of people. I think we were quite fortunate that we could fit in the right number of PDRAs. PDRAs do a lot of work on the ground, right? They do all the work on the ground. But sometimes if you've got to have an academic stepping in to do the role of a PDRA, it just slows everything down kind of massively. Whereas to some extent, we could say, Navid, Outlook, talk to each other, do it, sort of thing. And that makes it much easier compared to if you've got, say, 20% a person and they can only speak 1 day a week or whatever. I mean, I think otherwise it is just it's a classic one of communication, right? There are challenges, not in this collaboration, but in a different one. So one of the teams, the more qualitative team, was kind of writing papers, and they kept putting me as the last author, which to me is great. In engineering, that's the standard. That's where I want to be as a PI. And I was like, why are you doing this? You should be the lead author. It's coming out of your work package. And they're like, oh, no, it's bad for us to be at the end. We want to be here. And I know it's easy to say communication, but I think it always just down to, kind of working through those phases. You can get frameworks right and just, starting on day one of what does success look like? What does success look like for you versus somebody else? And just I think a little bit of time makes a big difference. I think also I'll stop talking but also good collaborators as well, right? I think particularly on the light sensing project, everyone wanted the project to succeed in a way that you don't need to be, I need to be this author or that author. It's just, we've got some great stuff, let's do it, kind of a way.
Yeah. Well, that sounds hardly like you need to be a bit lucky who you manage to get on your team, but it also sounds that it's basically investment of time and energy, but also of money to make sure you've got enough capacity of, in this case, postdocs that can do a bit of the finding out how to work together, rather than having academics needing to step in and slowing everything down. Yep, really great, Alex. Are there any other questions from people in the virtual room? If not, Elena, I think you'll be sharing the recording and potentially the slides, or just a recording?
Well, we'll upload the main part of the recording, the presentation, on the Christabel Pankhurst YouTube page, so you'll be able to see it. And for anyone that registered on Eventbrite, they will receive also the link directly from me. Otherwise,
Perfect.
you can find it, as I said, on
Wonderful.
the YouTube.
Do you know when the next one is? I should have probably looked that up before I...
No, unfortunately, we haven't announced it yet, so I'm expecting it will be either end of November or beginning of December. But hear through the same
exactly.
channels.
Yeah. You'll send that out once you know. All right. Well, thanks very much again, Alex, for your talk, and thanks everybody for joining. And people in Canada, have a good day, and the people in Manchester, almost the end of the afternoon. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.